So in light of the critique given, and my reply to it, what more can we do about addressing and undoing this critique? Certainly within our own lives, we try and strive to live a life consistent with what we believe. The biggest temptation is to simulate the blessed life of grace in order to deceive or do patchwork, but in the end, we only do a disservice to God, neighbor, and self. In all that we do, we must do it with prayer, genuine striving, and humble honesty. Without these things, people won't see what the true regenerate life looks like, nor see the joy which comes with it. With that said, how can we uproot the fact that most of the baptized who still go to church seem to have more in common with the unbaptized than is probably warranted? Whether the problem is ignorance or knowing too much, the problem resides in an issue of studiousness. This is a virtue, and between all virtue is the extreme of lack and excess. In this case, ignorance and curiosity, or having your nose in everything. We need an inspired studiousness in order to get people to know what the blessed life of grace actually is, and how to grow in it, and how Mass is essential to that life. How do I define inspired studiousness? Seeking first to know where I am going, how I am to get there, how what the Church offers is eminently relevant, and to then expand my horizons beyond myself. Whether the issue is a hopeless idealism, grounded on a love still stuck in the honeymoon stage of a marriage, or defeated pessimism, grounded on the popping of that idealistic bubble, again the virtue will be found somewhere in the midst of these two extremes. The virtue that is needed here is a patient or long-suffering realism grounded on the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. Ultimately, all of these recommendations are grounded in the theological virtues, but this one will require more proactive acts of faith, proactive acts of hope, and proactive acts of love. The definition is in the action of the theological virtues. Finally, the issue of mirroring of the leaders can only be resolved by being exposed to authentic and reverent liturgies, and understanding first why it's done like that. And then that will lead you to cultivate the correct dispositions while you are there. That way, even if you find yourself around bad or poor leaders, you know in what manner to behave and correct, not just those on your level, but even humbly those who are supposed to be above you. Of course, the greatest care must be taken. Therefore, the virtue here is between the vice of timidity and zealotry. There needs to be a meek indignation and irreverent and all too human worship. Now, is meekness a weakness? Is it timidity? No. Our Lord and Moses in the Old Testament were both called meek, but were they cowards? Absolutely not. Rather, meekness means one is self-possessed. They do not let the passions, particularly the passion of anger, to consume and confuse them, and thus affect their decisions. Having tried to satisfy the first problem, we need to ask ourselves, how can we uproot the fact that people in church don't seem happy but rather dour? So I discussed the problem of a willful ignorance. Some aspect of the truth saddens them exactly because it calls them to detachment from some creaturely affection. As one grows in the spiritual or interior life, that growth also hits obstacles, and there is a struggle that ensues. But how do we find joy in the midst of different desires trying to pull us in opposite directions? Well, you don't. Honesty is vital here, to God, to yourself, and the thing you struggle with. In a sense, we have both to ask for and cultivate a holy honesty and detachment. Such a request, though, needs a long-suffering patience in order for the prayer to be answered in the fullest sense. Eventually, joy will be restored. The next issue is spiritual defeatism. Ironically, people themselves know they are unchanged, but they say they had been at this for quite some time and still feel unchanged. Again, the spirit of despondency really has a grip on them, and it's the grip which must be broken. It's almost the logical outcome of the prior issue, because whereas before one struggled, now one just stalls. What's the solution? I find possessiveness to be the underlying problem. And the only way I think it's possible at this time to break it is to get rid of the things in your life, especially creature comforts. One will eventually go, cold turkey on the thing they are too attached to, and one will stop stalling. Of course, during this time, I recommend praying to God for greater detachment from worldly things and to show you the transient nature of it all. Just as an aside, creatures, all created things, are good. The issue does not lay in them, but in ourselves. Every created good we desire ultimately points to God. We deal with a spiritual addiction called concupiscence, wherein we have an obsessive and compulsive concern for created goods exactly because our relationship with the Spirit had become degraded in our nature. This is what idolatry is, though, elevating any and all creatures to the level of divinity. Finally, when it comes to nominalism, the substance of worship and living a God-centered life is no longer present, but the appearances are present. Ultimately, this problem lies in honesty and dishonesty before God, neighbor, and self. It can only be resolved by applying all the prior points and to make acts of honesty, actions consistent with where and what you are. Perfectionism is implicit here too, where people simulate piety but are just simply not living any longer. They've become dead inside, but look alive outside. It's a zombified spirit, and as such people become confused about what going to church is about. Nonetheless, while we can only admonish or encourage those who fell into this state, we should not be condemning of them. We don't know how and why they let themselves get this far out, or what plans God has for them.